Good morning and welcome, both to folks who are here in person and folks who will watch later on video. For folks who I've yet to meet, my name is Atiya Ahmed. I'm an associate professor of anthropology and international affairs here at GW. I'm also the interim director of the Institute of Middle East Studies, and we are delighted to have you here as part of our annual conference entitled Imaginary Divides, the Middle East and Africa Across Empires, Oceans, and Borders. In recent years, significant shifts have been afoot in both the substance and process of knowledge production. One way of encapsulating this is through a shorthand phrase. This is not about X, but it is about X. Whether it be scholars like Lisa Lowe, who are recharting our understanding of geographies and histories beyond the nation state, or area studies driven divisions by pushing us to consider the intimacy of continents, or whether it be feminist scholars who have long pushed us to consider the processual nature of gendered subjectivities, gender differences, and their interrelation and co-constitution, their intersection with forms of subjectivity and hierarchized difference, like race, class, and sexuality, and consider this in relation to our planet, our multi-species companions and others, to our built worlds and technoscience states, and I could go on. Or whether it be scholars inspired by or thinking in resonant terms with Deleuzian approaches that recognize expressions are always already connected to what the late, great Diane Nelson refers to as the whole kit and caboodle. This is not about X, but it is about X, pushes us to consider, create, and critique by recognizing connections and interrelations between topics, disciplines, and areas that have previously been treated as distinct. This is not about X, but it is about X, captures both the sense that there are increasing cracks, perhaps openings, to approach our scholarship in ways not hemmed in by conventionally conceived topics, disciplines, and areas. Yet it also captures how we remain beholden to these same topics, disciplines, and areas. So this conference is not about Indigenous or Native studies, but it is about Indigenous and Native studies. We are gathered and working here today in the unceded territory of the Nukotchink, the Anacostan, and the Piscataway, Indigenous folks whose lands were forcibly taken and who have yet to receive justice. In addition to this land acknowledgement, I would also like to share with you information about Indigenous DC, a mobile application and digital map of Indigenous sites of importance in this area. This award-winning app was developed by Professor Elizabeth Rule of the Chickasaw Nation, our former GW colleague, now at American University, whose departure has further weakened an already under-resourced Center on Indigenous Studies that has yet to be addressed here at GW. This conference is not about the Middle East, but it is about the Middle East. The underlying question animating our conference today is, what happens to scholarship focusing on the Middle East when we interrogate the naturalized borders between the Middle East and North Africa and are attentive to its interrelation and connections to regions beyond the Sahel and the Indian Ocean? We have three panels that examine this theme today, this question today. Our first panel, entitled Third Worldism and South-South Solidarity, focuses on forms of solidarity and organizing that cross-cuts and connects these regions, including forms of dissident Pan-Africanism, as discussed by Tolan Skilnick in her examination of the militant artist Maghreb Generation, rural radicalism, as discussed by Mampili, drawing on recent cases in Tanzania, Sudan, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, and a searching examination of the conditions of possibility of solidarity at our contemporary conjuncture by Al-Baluchi. Our second panel, entitled Maritime Spaces and Global Mobilities, examines the significance of maritime spaces as both barrier and conduit connecting the Middle East, Africa, and Indian Ocean regions. Here we will learn about the Ingress into India Ordinance and Foreigner Ordinance, which, as Mawani underscores, reveals the significance of maritime spaces in the expansion of imperial carceral regimes. Dua's paper on maritime spaces pushes us to consider choke points as generative spaces of slowness, stuckness, and interruptions that serve as an argument for what he refers to as the significance of methodological and conceptual co-presence. Hopper's paper about the lives of formerly enslaved Africans at Aden in the late 19th century reveals ongoing forms of power they are subject to, and how anti-slavery should not be taken as synonymous with a radical anti-racist or anti-imperial perspective, but rather can reinscribe imperial racial prejudice. Our third and final panel, entitled Power Politics Within the Global South, focuses on race thinking and race work in both Iran and the Ottoman Imperium through fine-grained analyses of two travelogues of an Arab Ottoman official visiting the Eastern Sahara and the Horn of Africa in the late 19th and early 20th century, as discussed by Minali, and as well as the stories of Hizran and Nargis that underscore the association between Blackness and enslavement in 19th century Bandar Abbas and Tehran, Bahuzadeh. We have a lot here to look forward to today. But before we start in earnest, just a few more words. This conference is not about individuals, but it is about individuals. It is about Kristen Clinton, who ensured that we all got here, we all had places to sleep, and we all eat. Does it so seamlessly and so well. Thank you, Kristen. It is about Shana Marshall, who, if you've not yet had the pleasure, I can give you a little bit of insight. She does everything, and she does everything so damn well. So thank you, Sheena. About our student colleagues, Madam, Kinda, Nuha, Omar, Adelina, who make so much possible. Thank you. It is about Mona Arabi, Shana Marshall, Melanie McAllister, and Mona Atiya, who conceived of and developed this conference. Thank you. And back to Mona Atiya. It is also about Mona Atiya, the regular director of the Institute of Middle East Studies, who is on sabbatical this year, yet as a testament to her commitment to IMIS is here, and who has been so instrumental in making this conference possible, including being an absolute integral part of bringing a Title VI grant back to GWs. Thank you, Mona. The list, some of our senior colleagues, so Skip Ganane, Nathan Brown are also here. They have been an integral part of building up IMIS and Middle East Studies here at GW. Thank you for coming. It is also, of course, about our individual presenters, the discussants, and chairs for taking the time to be here and to share your work. Finally, I promise, this conference is not about institutions and organizations, but it is about institutions and organizations. Funding for this conference was provided by a Title VI grant awarded to IMIS by the U.S. Department of Education. The Institute of Middle East Studies is able to do so much at a time of budget cuts, the neoliberalization of higher education, continued crackdowns on shared governance, and administrative neglect or administrative overreach, due to the relations we actively seek to maintain with other groups committed to critical and creative scholarship on the Middle East and beyond. This conference has been made possible through collaboration we very much hope to maintain with our colleagues at Howard University. At IMIS, we are so fortunate to work in collaboration and coordination with other institutions and organizations, including MESA, MERA, COMIPS, and so many others. We value and fight for these relationships. Thank you for your time. Before I leave the stage, I have the pleasure of introducing the chair of our first panel, Dr. Anahid Al-Fardan, who is an associate professor of sociology at Howard University. Dr. Fardan is the author of Palestinians in Syria, Nakba Memories of Shattered Communities, that was published by Columbia University Press in 2016. She is also principal investigator on Afro-Asian Futures Past, a Mellon-funded collaborative research program on the African-Asian decolonization era between Howard University the American University of Beirut, the University of Ghana, the University of Cape Town, and the University of Whitburn Forest. Someone help.
You just say this. Just say this.
Yes.
Say this.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Tia. Good morning, everyone. We're 15 minutes over time, so we'll ease into our break by 15 minutes. I hope this is okay with everyone. I'm going to introduce the panelists in the way they're listed in the program, as well as our chair, and the titles of our paper, and with your institutional affiliation. And there's more information on the website. So our first speaker today is Dr. Paraska Tolan Skilnik. I'm sorry if I'm slaughtering your name. Assistant Professor of History at Suffolk University in Boston. We'll be talking about Maghreb Noir, Pan-African Futures in North Africa. Our second speaker is Professor Zakaria Mampili from Baruch College at City University of New York, who's the Marx Endowed Chair of International Affairs at the Marx School of Public and International Affairs, as well as a member of the Doctoral Faculty in the Department of Political Science at the Graduate Center in the City University of New York. We'll be talking about rural radicalism and social movements in Africa. And our third speaker is Dr. Yusuf Belushi, who's in the Department of Global International Studies at the University of California in Irvine. He'll be talking about solidarity and the Dar es Salaam School. And our discussant is Dr. Rosie Bashir, who's an associate professor of history at Harvard University. So 15 minutes, I'll prompt you at 10 and for everyone, including our discussant, and then we'll open the floor for about half an hour. Okay, over to you.
Thanks. Thank you for the introduction. So I'm going to give you a short, brief presentation of the 5th chapter of my book, which is coming out in July, Maghreb Noir. And the book traces a group of individuals that I call the Maghreb generation, which are people from across the African continent, but also the Caribbean and the United States, who came to the Maghreb in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And I call them the Maghreb generation because of the importance that the Maghreb played in their political development. And they came because at the invitation often of Maghrebi governments who had these Pan-African projects that they were organizing. But I argue that they created their own Pan-Africanism, their dissenting Pan-Africanism in the margins of these big Pan-African projects. So I'm going to give you a brief excerpt from the 5th chapter, which centers on the Journée cinématographique de Carthage, a film festival in Tunisia that started in '66 as a biennale and is actually still ongoing, is an annual festival now, which occurs in downtown Tunis. It's sort of a misnomer every year. So the sort of mythical story of the creation of the JCC, is there a clicker? Is there a way to change the slides? Right. Sorry, I realized that. Okay. The mythical story of the JCC starts with perfect. Thank you. Starts with Tahed Sharia, who was a Tunisian film critic and producer, traveling to the Cannes Film Festival in May 1966. And for the first time, he says, seeing African film in the form of Ousmane Sembène's La Noire 2, a movie about the dehumanizing effects of racism on this young woman who travels to France. And when he sees this movie, Sharia realizes in his words that cinema is a powerful tool that can illustrate the African experiences to the masses. So he invites Sembène to the inaugural event of the Journée cinématographique de Carthage in 1966. And Sembène has huge success, wins the festival's prize, the Tanit d'Or that year, and according to the myth, inspires generations of young African filmmakers to follow in his footsteps. Can you click the next? Both men have been lionized since then. This is a poster of Mohamed Chalouf, Tunisian documentary filmmakers, documentary Tahed Sharia à l'ombre du baobab, just sort of a play on words, both the fact that he's going to West Africa and spending a lot of time literally under baobab trees, but also baobab being sort of the elder. So we're in the shadow of the elder that is Tahed Sharia. And the one on the right is Semba Gajigo's 2015 movie, Sembène. What you see in the middle is the 26th edition poster for the GCC, which shows both men proudly puffing away at their pipes. They're basically, I mean, it's almost impossible to find a picture of Sebben online where he's not pulling on his pipe. And so many people that I talked to when I was doing interviews, researching the GCC, many people would talk about this creation story, this mythical story, and really used it as a way to illustrate Tunisia's particular claim to Pan-Africanism. Ferid Bourdir, who's a Tunisian film director, most famous for Un été à la Goulette or Halfaween, told me in a 2018 interview that Tunisia remains the most Pan-African of the Maghrebi countries when it comes to film and to culture in general. Really, in the history of Pan-Africanism, Tunisia gets very little love. Algeria really gets all the attention, at least in the history of Pan-Africanism in the Maghreb. So very little attention in general to the Maghreb, but when there is, it is to Algeria. Morocco and Tunisia are often overlooked. Tunisia's role in hosting liberation movements in the 60s and 70s is practically ignored, unknown. Until 2011, many European and American scholars tended to see Tunisia, as scholar Jocelyne Dahlia puts it, as a little Europe of the Enlightenment, as a country turned north towards Europe, towards the Mediterranean, rather than south towards the rest of the African continent. Part of it was because Bourguiba, the father of the Tunisian nation, the first president, really tried to export this idea of a country on the cusp of modernity. His state doctrine was Bourguibisme, which rested on the values of liberalism, state-controlled Islam, and autonomy from Arab states. When asked about Pan-Africanism, unlike his Algerian neighbors, Bourguiba was really you know, he said he was a realist. To be a realist is to prefer a modest reform to an impossible miracle. So he didn't really believe in the sort of projects of Pan-Africanism, some of the more radical projects of Pan-Africanism. When in 1966, the Tunisian film critic and producer Tahar Sharia came to Bourguiba asking him if he could create the Journée cinématographique de Carthage under the umbrella of the Tunisian Ministry of Culture. Bourguiba gave the project his blessing. And I think in many ways, this was because Bourguiba saw subsidizing festivals such as the GCC as a way to compete with Algeria's Pan-African draw, and a way to compete in a way that Bourguiba liked, as in, you know, a festival that would attract artists over militants, filmmakers over rabble-rousers. In the late 1960s and 70s, African filmmakers really benefited from state support in the Maghreb. Tunisian director Abdellatif Ben Ammar, who you see here, says that politicians saw film as a way to restore the images of independence leaders, talk about the War of Independence and showcase the courage of their leaders. Basically, the Maghrebi government saw this as an opportunity to create blockbusters about, you know, the struggle for independence. So they were funding Maghrebi filmmakers, and they built movie theaters, and they circulated cinema minibuses, and they funded festivals like the GCC, and they nationalized the Maghrebi screens and sort of wrestled them away from American and European corporate control. But Ben Ammar, of course, said, you know, we weren't interested in lingering on the past. We weren't interested in the project of the Tunisian government. He told me in an interview, it's as if French filmmakers had only made movies about de Gaulle on June 18th. The African filmmaker lived in the present. He was interested in the question of women and denouncing the abuse of power. So this did not make the state happy. The filmmakers in Tunisia and the Tunisian government did have the project of Pan-Africanism in common. The Pan-African ideals of the filmmakers in some ways at first didn't threaten the Maghrebi states or the Tunisian states. For Bourguiba and for many other leaders in the Maghrebi states, Pan-Africanism sort of respected the Manichaean divide between the West and the rest, between Africans on the one hand and Europeans on the other. So to many, but in the end, to many Maghrebis, The project of Pan-Africanism became one of the few places where they could express dissent in the post-colonial regimes, a safe way of expressing resistance and evading the nation state through Pan-African networks. So the GCC was created with the blessing of the Tunisian government, but in reality, the Tunisian government didn't really have the infrastructure to create this event. So they placed it in the hands of the FTCC, the Fédération Tunisienne des Ciné-Clubs, which is one of the few places in Tunisia where dissidents really thrived, where resistance to Bourguiba's regime really thrived. The FTCC, which was created in 1950, was one of the largest non-governmental organizations in Tunisia. It had about 100,000 members across the country. And it directed the cultural directed the cultural activities of cine clubs throughout the country. And sometimes the cine club was the only form of socialization. They had cine clubs in even very remote areas of the country. So the leaders of the FTCC really had their finger on the pulse of the country. So beginning in 1968, a project, the GCC, a project that had been started by the Tunisian government and subsidized by the Tunisian state, really began to escape the Tunisian state's control because of the FTCC and started broadcasting this ideology of dissenting Pan-Africanism. Throughout the 1970s, the GCC became a space of dissenting Pan-Africanism. Some directors said that the films actually forgoed any sort of aesthetic consideration and were only political films that challenged the established power paradigms. The Europeans did not love it. One Belgian daily newspaper, La Libre Belgique, wrote that the GCC has demonstrated the victory of militant movies. It preaches, implicitly or not, violence, hate, and vengeance. It is a never-ending chain, alas. In many ways, this change was spurred by the African filmmakers who were coming regularly, who had become staples of the Carthage Film Festival. Ousmane Sembène, who you met earlier, Guadeloupean film director Sarah Maldoror, and Mauritanian Med Ondo. Sembène said it was not Tunisia that made Carthage, it was the Africans, and he called Carthage Africa's vengeance. Maldoror said when she came to Tunisia, she felt like she started to get to know herself, to get to know other Africans. She said when we were watching our movies, our dances, our histories, our loves, and our dreams. There, by exchanging gazes, we understood our differences. We were watching others, no longer being watched. Maldoror was one of the few female directors who actually got any form of acclaim at the GCC in the 70s. Like many of the Pan-African projects that I look at in my book, the GCC was the domain of men. Maldoror, who was Guadeloupean from her father's side, like Sembène, studied film in Moscow at the Moscow Film Academy. And while she actually, I trace her and her family across the Maghreb. She lived in Morocco in the late 1950s with her partner, Mario de Andrade, an Angolan militant, and then in Algeria in the 60s, and then traveled to Tunisia regularly in the 70s. This is a picture of her while she was living in Algeria, assisting Gilles Pontecorvo on the filming of the Battle of Algiers. She's on the top corner. In 1968, while she was also in Algiers, she shot her first film, Monogambe, which is only 17 minutes long and is based on a short story by José Luandino Vieira. And the funny thing about this film is actually all the Portuguese are played by Algerian actors. The movie was commissioned by the Algerian government and funded by the Algerian government. Her third film, Zambi Zanga, also won the Technique d'Or in 1972. And that's the story of Domingos and Maria, this couple enjoying life with their newborn child, and Domingos gets captured by the Angolan police. And the movie sort of follows Maria, the wife, looking for her husband through these jails, periodically calling out Domingos. And Maldoror was really trying to point out the ways in which Africans could sometimes be collaborating with the former colonial powers. There's one point in the movie where Maria is being escorted out of the police station by Black police officers, and she screams at him, "Get off me, you shitty turncoat. You are with the whites. You make us suffer." Through films like this, by centering women, Maldoror was really trying to argue that women were agents of change in Angola and across Africa, and really go against the pervasive idea that the struggle for liberation was mostly a male struggle for liberation. Okay, I'm gonna finish. She talked about only being interested in women who struggle. She got kicked out of Algeria actually for centering women in one of her stories, in Des Fusils pour Banta, which was commissioned by the Algerian government. She got kicked out for centering this woman. This guy came up to her and was like, "Oh, you need to change. This needs to be about a dude." And she was like, "You're a shit captain," and spit in his face and got kicked out of Algeria. The films were destroyed. I can talk about it more. But essentially, she was one of the few women at the GCC and had to sort of protect herself from a lot of the racism and sexism that she that she suffered from at the GCC. So I'll finish there, but I'm happy to hear more. Thank you so much.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming out on a Friday morning like this. Thank you to the organizers for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here with another group of scholars working in this interdisciplinary space. I'm a kind of interloping political scientist. I don't know how many others are of my type are here, but hopefully I'll be able to tie it into some of the conference themes. So I'm going to talk about, my ongoing research project, which has been trying to look at kind of the wave of protests that have been unfolding across the African continent over the past decade or so. It's had its origin sort of in a trip I took down to southern Tanzania back in 2012 to Mtwara, which is a region on the border between Tanzania and Mozambique. Tanzania, I think, is important, as Yusuf will explain to us, in terms of its long history of solidarity movements and its centrality in both Afro-Asianism and third world internationalism. And that's been a long-standing interest of mine, and I'm very curious about the legacies of those movements for contemporary social movements in Africa. And so my research is really focused on the contemporary, but is informed by this longer history. So back in 2013, actually, the Tanzanian government had basically gone into this village in southern Tanzania, which was the site of this major oil pipeline that had been constructed with Chinese money and 10 multinational corporations. And the people in this village, an area which has always been at the forefront of the anti-apartheid struggle and has been asked to make a lot of sacrifices in the name of the Tanzanian nation, had been asking if they could receive some share of this gas pipeline that was coming through this region of Mtwara, because it's also one of the most economically backwards parts of the country. And the response from the government, as you can see, was to send in the army to occupy these villages for about 2 weeks and to destroy much of the central part of the town. You can see here, there's some slogans in graffiti, Gesi is gas, and Gesi Kwanza Mandangu is gas should be for us first, right? But the response from the Tanzanian state was very clear cut. This is the words of the Tanzanian president at the time: natural resources, regardless of the region where they are found, are the property of all Tanzanians. And the overwhelming attitude towards this uprising in rural areas of Tanzania was to dismiss this as the actions of these backward peasants, right? This was a surprisingly common sentiment in the media at the time. A lot of Tanzanian newspapers reported on these events and portrayed it as almost akin to a terrorist act that these villagers were protesting for a share of the resources. The attitudes were fairly widespread within Tanzanian Dar es Salaam society as well, in an overwhelming sense. In Mtwara, the site of these protests were backward, were traditional, primitive, and hence they had no politics to their protests. So this has been a question that I've been trying to puzzle through, trying to think about it in relation to histories of popular uprisings, revolutionary politics, and trying to understand specifically the role of the rural in contemporary uprisings. Right? And I think there's kind of a longstanding bias against understanding rural political mobilization. This is sort of ensconced in perhaps the two dominant modes of revolutionary politics that we have. One, of course, the Marxist mode of workers of the world uniting. That's a Chinese propaganda poster, industrial workers linked together, kind of a high point of Afro-Asianism. And the other side, what I would consider to be perhaps the dominant model today, what we might consider the liberal model of protests. Right, things that work through non-governmental organizations, very much focused on middle-class, urban, global north folks. If we were to organize these into kind of the assumptions behind each of these models, one side you have a kind of Marxist analysis that emphasizes the proletariat, it's predominantly a structural interpretation that focuses on the role of the proletariat in production. And the idea is, that the proletariat would create a vanguard political party that ultimately captures state power. The liberal model is very much focused on this concept of civil society. It's more of a contingent model that lays the emphasis fundamentally on the actions of the social movement itself. It's expected to articulate, organize, and clear demands, to rely on forms of moral suasion in order to pass legislation, fundamentally of a reformist type. Right? And I think these are the two kind of dominant paradigms that shape how we continue to think of popular uprisings, and in particular, why we tend to ignore rural popular protests in particular. So, some of these themes were things that we had discussed in our 2015 book on this subject of African protests. But I was kind of dissatisfied with that book because what we were trying to do in that book was to explain, these huge upsurge of protests that have been unfolding in Africa since 2005. In it, we provided a kind of longer-term history of African protests going back to the 1940s and 1950s, but the book was really focused on the most recent wave of protests, what we refer to as the third wave, and what I may refer to here as anti-post neo-colonial protests. And just to give you a sense, this has been a fairly widespread phenomenon. It's affected more than 40 countries across Africa. They're often sort of triggered by these electoral or economic crises, or morphing into these calls for a total overthrow of the political system. And they're often ignored because they fail to articulate clear demands, or with the introduction of violence into the protests, which is a common response to state repression, they are dismissed as riots. And I think there's a larger context for how we think about African protests in particular, which reflects longstanding biases of the African continent and the political action that emerges from there, that Africa is too rural, that it's too poor, or too ethnic for popular protests to be meaningful. So that brings us to this current work I've been doing, which is really trying to focus on how changes in global political economy have been impacting political action on the continent, and I would say more broadly throughout the so-called third world. And I think this is interesting because to me, in terms of this conference in particular, it really gets at some of the questions around Afro-Asianism and what that means today. Right? Because I think the paradigms that we look at this concept of Afro-Asianism have not been updated to take seriously some of the economic processes that have been unfolding or perhaps foiling the African continent over the past 2 decades. Most prominently, and here when I say Asia, I'm including West Asia. I'm sort of saying East in the US, but South Indian, we say West Asia. Asia has become a major player across the African continent, and I mean Asia in the broad sense. It's obviously China, but not just China. India, Malaysia, Turkey have all been playing very active roles in trying to invest into the African continent. The Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia as well, as we'll be hearing from Nisreen later, become major players in multiple sectors. So it's not just mining, but it's also agriculture and a whole variety of different sectors across African economies. And Asia has massively displaced Africa's historic trading partners, the EU and the United States, and now accounts for a larger share of trade than either the EU or the United States. It's important to understand the nature of these economic processes and how they are shaping politics on the continent. Most of this investment is directed into commodities. It has actually produced a tremendous amount of wealth on the African continent. Most African countries have grown by over 3% since 1995. But this has not actually produced the kind of broad-based prosperity that advocates of kind of neoliberal structural adjustment were advocating for when they encouraged African economies to open up their markets to foreign direct investment. Right? Some of this is captured by the economics literature. There's a term premature deindustrialization. So if you think about the concept of what foreign direct investment is supposed to do for African economies, the idea is that money would come into these countries and stimulate industrialization. And so that you would create more jobs and move people out of agricultural labor or out of the informal economy, put them into nice factory jobs in the manufacturing sector. This hasn't happened. Because almost all this investment is going towards the commodity sector. So what we've actually seen is a decrease in the share of industrial jobs in many African economies. Places like Kenya actually had more robust industrial sectors, a larger share of workers in the industrial sector in the 1980s than they do today. And of course, when you have this kind of economic situation prevailing, what you have is that the vast majority of this wealth that has come into African economies has been captured by very narrow sets of economic and political elites, which has produced a tremendous amount of growth, but no reduction in overall poverty. So we all know the stereotype of Nigerian billionaires who become more prominent, but Nigeria has also become the country with the largest number of people living in extreme poverty in the world. So these things are driven largely by the patterns of investment that are coming into Africa. And you see this across the continent. You see the emergence of these kind of archipelagos of tremendous prosperity where people live at first world standards alongside massive numbers of people who live in shanty towns and slums across most African cities today. Okay, let me move ahead. So what I'm interested in here is how this is shifting larger global order and then ultimately what it means for forms of popular protest. I think it's fair to say we are entering perhaps the end of the era of liberal internationalism. We are told that we are living through a period of populist nationalism, democratic backsliding, economic isolationism. I think these are important trends to take into mind. There are also these trends that are internal to many African countries that I'm interested in. Africa is urbanizing at a tremendous pace. It's still predominantly rural society, but the pace of urbanization is the highest in the world. Very young societies, youngest in the world by far. Huge gap between the age of the people and the rulers, about 43 years, which is the same gap between the average American and Joe Biden, who is the oldest president in American history. He would just be a whippersnapper in the African context. So the question is, how has Africa's incorporation into global capitalism impacted opposition parties? I won't go with this in too much, but I think one of the really interesting things for me looking at Africa today is that there are no left-dominated governments on the African continent. This is despite the fact that through the 1980s and 1990s, Africa had very robust left parties, communist parties in many countries. But none of these have actually been able to take power. And I think that's important for understanding why it is that political parties no longer seem to be vehicles for change that they once were hoped to be. There are some exceptions, but none of them are in power currently. What we see is that opposition parties, regardless of their background, tend to espouse the same common economic agenda. And even where you have some sort of movement between political parties on the continent, you don't see any shift in terms of the economic policies. Let me jump ahead. Like I'm almost out of time here. I want to get to the key themes of the paper itself, which is about this idea of rural protest. Rural has long been imagined as a pre-modern, violent, anti-national, and anti-development space in the African context. There have been some attempts to transform the nature of power by targeting traditional authorities. These are the exception, places like Tanzania and Uganda, by trying to cut the local chief, mostly unsuccessfully. Here's a quote from one of the chiefs I interviewed in Congo. I was there 2 weeks ago. And you can see their sense that they are losing power, but they also think that that's producing these disruptions, particularly in terms of rural land regimes. And I think that the question of the chief or the traditional authority is one that has kind of bedeviled analysts for a long time in terms of how we talk about rural political action. The assumption is that rural areas are governed by this kind of logic of decentralized despotism, to use Mbani's term, wherein political elites in the capitals relied on traditional authorities to manipulate them in order to advance their own agendas in these rural areas. I think much of this is now being changed, the argument I'm trying to make here, by the shifting nature of capitalism. As all of this foreign money has come into the rural areas, we've seen actually a diminishment of the power of the chief in rural areas that I think is a central part of why we should be paying more attention to what's happening. If we look at what's been happening in rural areas across the African continent, much of the foreign investment, as I mentioned, is being targeted towards these areas. It's having a huge impact on peasant subjectivities. Right? We're seeing that peasants are increasingly being transformed to wage laborers. There's a lot of mobility within these rural spaces as well. The new phenomenon, if you understand the nature of land tenure regimes in the African continent. And as I mentioned, it's leading to a diminishment of traditional authorities. And in some ways, increasing the power of the state. I'll tell you why that matters in a minute. One of the things I document is that there has been also a huge increase in armed protests. So let me jump ahead here because I have pictures. I think people also love to see pictures. So the three main things I've been tracing here is the way in which rural questions are increasingly mapping onto national questions, whether climate change, foreign direct investment, or militarization. There's a lot of circular migration that is happening. So the narrative around urbanization in Africa tends to assume that it's a one-way movement from rural to urban. But in fact, what you can see, and there's a long history of African scholars in particular documenting this, particularly people who work in peasant studies, that it has always been a circular dynamic and not just a one-way one. And that increasingly the state recognizes the importance of rural protests as part of their larger national counter-protest strategies. I think, again, we saw this very clearly in Sudan, where the movement really began in the rural areas, but states across Africa are starting to recognize the potency of rural protests and how quickly issues that emerge from the seeming peripheries can morph into these massive national phenomena. So this is the movement. I'll just end with some pictures that I've been studying for a while. It began in 2012 with a group of college students in Goma, which is the eastern part of the Democratic Republic of Congo. Congo, of course, is a site for a lot of this investment that's coming in from Asia. And so it is a place where I think you learn a lot about the kind of broader trends that have been shaping across the continent. They started off pretty much focused on voter education campaigns, but have kind of morphed into a larger anti-government movement. These are pictures I took from my recent trip, and I'll end with a couple of these. So some of you may know that Eastern Congo, Goma is kind of the center of this larger war stage in Eastern Congo that has been active for almost 3 decades now. And so you have fighting currently that has pushed thousands of people into the city of Goma, where they've settled into these empty lands north of the city. These are all been destroyed by the volcano, so it's a pretty inhospitable environment. And the movement, Lucha, has now started to move towards actually providing direct services to these displaced populations. So I visited one of the camps with the Lucha activists. They're dressed in black here. And you can see they're preparing food. They're actually the only organization that's providing food to displaced people in Eastern Congo. You can see some of the activists down there. These are the people that they're providing for. These are activists with Lucha. And I just want to end with these quotes from Lucha. Because I think what's interesting to me is the way that they're offering this kind of triple critique, right? They're critiquing the international agencies, which have been active in Eastern Congo since the 1990s. There's a lot of protests that they targeted towards the United Nations, which may be surprising, but I'll explain why the UN presence is viewed very hostily. So it's again a divergence from earlier traditions of Afro-Asianism, where the UN is viewed as a potential site in which countries in the global south advance their agendas. There's a lot more skepticism for the international agencies and their presence in these regions. See this in terms of the presence of non-governmental organizations as well. Lucha explicitly has not registered itself, does not take funds from international foundations. They're very wary of financial capitalism, and they're very skeptical about the role of NGOs in Eastern Congo. They have very clear attitudes in terms of how they are viewing the international presence there. Here you can see very clearly MONUSCO is the UN mission in Eastern Congo, and vitriol that activists have towards it. And this is the last one I have. One of the things interesting about Lucha is their skepticism of the state, their skepticism of the international community, and kind of their efforts to try to puzzle through what that actually means for their own movement, right? And one of the things that multiple of the Lucha activists told me is that they regard themselves as an anarchist. And I think that opens up sort of different kind of politics around potentials for solidarity than perhaps the kind of more state-centric focuses of the earlier iterations of operations in third international. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, thanks again to the organizers. Thanks, Datia, for the invitation. It's really exciting to be here with a fantastic group of thinkers. What I plan to offer today are a collection of relatively scattered thoughts on the theme we've been asked to grapple with, solidarity. So in what follows, I take a cue from Sandro Mezadra's argument that, quote, solidarity is not and should not be simply taken as the basis of struggle. It's rather conceived as a state, as an outcome of a struggle that involves and transforms heterogeneous subjects, histories, imaginaries, and experiences. My reflections also emerge from 3 ongoing projects that I've been involved in. They're not so much the product of coherent research findings, unlike my panelists, as they are scaffolding on which to hang what have been persistent political and intellectual questions. 2 of these projects have been centered in the arguably trans-regional Indian Ocean cities of Durban, South Africa, and Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, both crossing points for indentured Indian laborers and traders, Arab seafarers, slave traders and colonizers, and Swahili and Zulu speaking Africans, among many others. My first book manuscript on Durban, which I'm currently in the process of finishing, takes up a movement of shack dwellers for the lessons I believe they have to offer, broader debates that many other movements are grappling with in different parts of the world. And there's lots of resonances, I think, what Zach just shared about each other. I've also begun a second research project examining the intellectual history and geography of Dar es Salaam during the 1960s and the 1970s, a period when the city became an epicenter for political and intellectual solidarity between ongoing anti-colonial struggles on the African continent and the broader Third World liberation movements. So the title of my talk takes its cue from this project, but it does so more by way of analogy, hoping to think from the model of solidarity at play in Dar es Salaam during the heyday of the anti-colonial struggles, rather than to think about Dar School specifically. The third and most immediate project I've been involved in is a year-long seminar at UC Irvine focused on W.B. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction in America. In the seminar, we've approached the conversation through a provocation to take up Black Reconstruction as a portal, riffing off of Arundhati Roy's remarks as COVID-19 began to spread across the world in April 2020. So our provocation has therefore been to take up the 1935 intervention authored by Du Bois, Black Reconstruction, also as a portal that challenged notions of progress and linear time by unveiling the structural time of slavery and its afterlife, and that also unveiled the cyclical time of people's movements that periodically ruptured the status quo and repeatedly seemed to emerge out of nowhere when no one could have predicted them, most recently in 2011, 2014, and 2020 around the world. So as a portal then, Black Reconstruction can and should be taken up in 2023 and beyond as a window into our past, present, and future, and perhaps most particularly as the transnationally and transregionally relevant text Du Bois intended it to be. As he puts it in the culminating pages of the very first chapter, quote, "That dark sea of human labor in China and India, the South Seas and all Africa, in the West Indies and Central America and in the United States, that great majority of mankind on whose bent and broken backs rest today the founding stones of modern industry, shares a common destiny. The emancipation of man is the emancipation of labor, and the emancipation of labor is the freeing of that basic majority of workers who are yellow, brown, and black." Surprising, in a book we tend to associate with a kind of an exclusive focus on the Civil War and the US War and its aftermath. As Bill Mullen demonstrates in his aptly titled biography, W.B. Du Bois, Revolutionary Across the Color Line, the 1930s represented both the decade in which Du Bois published his magnum opus, Black Reconstruction, and the period of his Asia turn. As Mullen says, his use of Marxist analysis in Black Reconstruction and his attempt to understand slavery's role in the development of global capitalism culminated in a second trip abroad in 1936, this one a return to the Soviet Union, but included first-time visits to Japan and China, epicenters of what Du Bois perceived as a nascent world revolutionary situation. By the time of his return from that trip, Du Bois was more committed than ever to support for world revolution against capitalism and the decolonization of the planet. Indeed, as Mullen reminds us in his earlier book, which incidentally could also have been titled for this conference, Afro-Orientalism, Du Bois wrote over 100 articles on China, Japan, and India over the course of his lifetime. And this is a point that Zachariah also makes in his fantastic recent overview of Du Bois's work in foreign affairs. So as Mullen explains in Afro-Orientalism, Du Bois's conception of Asia as the solution to the riddle of the universe proposed Afro-Asian mutuality and recognition as a cornerstone of global liberation. Today, we're challenged to think the problem of solidarity in a new conjuncture, defined by both continuities and discontinuities with the past. Arguably, one defining characteristic of our current moment is a prevailing zeitgeist that deploys a form of political pessimism aimed at questioning the possibility and sometimes even the desirability of any form of transracial, transnational, transregional solidarity. We need look no further than the recent pronouncements by President Said of Tunisia to understand the enduring power of anti-Blackness in the Arab world. And yet, this has not prevented commentators like Paul Gilroy from arguing in his recent introduction to the collected writings of Stuart Hall's selected writings on race and difference for an analytical replacement of anti-Blackness with the more general category of racism used by Hall. I suspect, and Gilroy states as much, that this analytical attachment to the broader category of racism emerges from his corresponding desire to resuscitate a notion of political Blackness, a category that's open to all people of color, and in Fred Moten's terms, even to white people. This desire of Gilroy's for a contemporary return to political Blackness is one that's shared by his co-editor, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, and she's remarked several times in recent interviews and public talks. Turning to the African continent, we can detect a similar countervailing move by Achille Mbembe, who in his critique of Black reason offers us the provocative notion of the becoming Black of the world, a formulation intended to describe the increasingly scrambled racial logics of suffering that now apply to much of the world's population in his mind. And despite the critiques leveled at it for its potential wholesale displacement of the politics of life with the politics of death, I think it's clear that his earlier formulation of necropolitics was intended to do something similar, by offering a degree of political commensurability between African warscapes and Palestinian struggles. So a second defining characteristic of our current moment, as Mampili also reminds us and just finished mentioning as well, is that we're living in an age defined by the waning of American imperium. Sandra Mazadra argues that the relative decline of a Western-centered world order, quote, would be quite a rupture with a 5 centuries long history. And there's a need to take stock of its meaning, both in terms of its potentialities and in terms of its risks. And Nasreen El-Amin's work represents an important reminder of the scrambled racial geopolitical logics of our evolving world order. And Nasreen El-Amin's work on the eager participation of Arabian Gulf countries in the new scramble for African land represents another important reminder of the scrambled racial geopolitical logics of our evolving world order. This throws another wrench in the political project of trans-regional ties and of Du Bois's dreams of Afro-Asian solidarity emerging after the eventual demise of American Western hegemony. All of this brings to mind Hart and Negri's turn of the century book, Empire, and in particular the epigraph by William Morris, "Men fight and lose the battle, and the thing that they fought for comes about in spite of their defeat. And then it turns out not to be what they meant, and other men have to fight for what they meant under another name." In other words, to pose the question of trans-regional and transracial solidarity in our current conjuncture entails, at least in part, grappling with the simultaneous defeat and victory of the Third Worldist Project's efforts to displace a Euro-American centered world, a battle we're clearly winning with something better, a battle we're arguably losing. And it requires us to tackle the simultaneous tendencies of a move away from the political category of people of color to ever more refined acronyms such as BIPOC on the one hand, and the countervailing attempts by certain theorists on the other hand to generate or recuperate categories of analysis that might prove more conducive to the political project of solidarity and to the recognition of the ongoing production of at least partially shared subjectivities across otherwise heterogeneous positionalities and geographies. Two recent critiques of identity politics by Kianga Yamada-Taylor and Olufemi Taiwo are helpful here, especially because they remain very much attached to political projects grounded in Black radicalism and feminism. Taylor's revisiting of the origins and evolution of intersectionality through a return to the specific politics of the Combahee River Collective and some of its key founders, How We Get Free, reminds us that many of the collective's founders got their political start through a desire to express solidarity with the Vietnamese people in the anti-war movement. And if, as Taiwo has argued in his critique of the elite capture of prevailing forms of identity politics, all politics are coalition politics, then we need to pay close attention to the perhaps fleeting, but nonetheless incredibly powerful moments when resonances of the common link people in contemporary struggles across difference. So what might a similar set of analytical and political commitments look like from the vantage point, the crossroads between Africa and the Middle East? I find the work of a key figure in the Dar School, Mahmoud Mamdani, and the recent collaborative work between Eleni Zeleke and Arash Tavari on Third World historical emblematic in this regard. Three of Mamdani's writings stand out. First, his 2004 Good Muslim, Bad Muslim, in which he argues for a shift in analytical focus of the geography, the war on terror from the Middle East to Africa. Second, in his writing on Sudan, Saviors and Survivors, where he sought to push back against American racialized discourse of genocide in Darfur, presented by organizations like Save Darfur as Arabs killing Africans, where he problematizes both those categories. And third, his work on trans-African slavery. So in this third project, he's taking up the challenge of thinking slavery from the specific vantage point of Africa and the Middle East in what he calls trans-African slavery. Here he aims at extending and bracketing what he argues is a historically and geographically specific Black Atlantic model for understanding slavery that nonetheless presents itself in universal terms. He has Orlando Patterson's work, I think, in mind, his structuralist and trans-historical account of the constituent elements of slavery presented in Slavery and Social Death. So as Mamdani says, as the Middle Passage became the prototype of the slave trade, scholars looked for matching atrocities across the Sahara to illustrate the point and press it home. So this is history by way of analogy, a framework he's been critiquing for the past few decades since it's the subject. Instead, he finds it more productive to think against categories like Islamic slavery to pull out what was slightly different about trans-African slavery within Africa, across the Sahara, across the Red Sea, across the Indian Ocean, using geographic terms rather than religious terms, from the Atlantic model. And this requires counter-archival work, or even dismissing the archive, as he tells us in some cases, in favor of more experimental linguistic methods that are attentive to the specificities of the meaning of slavery and the words used for race in particular languages, and which he argues do not always easily translate into our now dominant categories. Also writing in the journal Comparative Studies of South Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, Eleni Zeleke and Arash Tavari have argued for a notion of the third world historical by way of rethinking revolution from Ethiopia to Iran. Can these revolutionary events across regions be advanced alongside or as a replacement for the supposedly more general and therefore world historical relevance of the French and American revolutions? The political problem they advance concerns the question I opened my remarks with: how to rethink the question of solidarity in the particular context of our current moment. How to learn from past movements without either reproducing their pitfalls or pretending like models can merely be cut and paste from very different conjunctures. While I think they're appreciative of attempts to resuscitate notions of the third world as a project, they argue that an overly statist framework dominates in many of these existing accounts, obscuring the historical and certainly contemporary challenges of both an exclusively statist politics and the new geographies of a scrambled empire where actors like Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and India are all engaged in the new scramble for Africa. In an effort to rethink the failures and successes of third world revolutions in our current conjuncture, they ask, what is political community from the period of decolonization until now? How do you form political communities such that people can prosper? And these questions, they argue, direct our perspective away from the Westphalian system, and it is to be hoped away from violence. So I believe these questions can also serve as useful guideposts in our own efforts to rethink the question of solidarity at the geographical juncture of Africa and the Middle East, and at the historical juncture of the demise of American hegemony and the rise of a diffuse and increasingly violent form of global empire.
Good morning, everyone. Before I start, I want to thank all the organizers and everyone studies for all the care and thoughtfulness, I think, that went into crafting a conference such as this one. And of course, for inviting me to engage and read and learn from all of you. I'm going to say a few words, taking us just away from this a little bit, about my own field, Middle East studies, and the question of imaginary divides in the conference description of that particular question, before turning to the questions, and then opening it up to the Q&A. So in the last 10 years or so, we have witnessed a gradual decentering of Egypt and the Levant from Middle East studies. Our scholarly gaze turned instead to regions that have long been sidelined and severed, regions such as the Arabian Peninsula and North Africa, both of which are only now being seriously incorporated into Middle East studies. And I should say they're being seriously incorporated in the Middle East studies on multiple scales, so local, regional, and global. So just as scholars are now approaching North Africa as a node, as a geographical and analytical bridge that connected and still connects deeply intertwined worlds further south and across surrounding oceans and seas, the Arabian Peninsula too has enabled us to trace multinodal networks and links that were occluded with the advent of the post-Ottoman states. Links with places like the Indian Ocean world, East Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and what have you. So I celebrate this development, knowing full well that even within these two subfields, many occlusions, many exclusions persist, with some people, regions, spaces, topics being centered at the expense of others. The Algerian War, for example, the Algerian War of Independence, is one such process that has attracted more than its fair share of scholarly attention at the expense of other processes in an otherwise understudied region, as Colin Skilnick reminds us. And where race, for instance, has been historically central to the diverse life worlds in these two regions, it is only now that race is being taken seriously as an analytic, at least in Middle East studies. Just a couple of decades after trailblazers such as Eve Powell and Sarah Gualtieri and others began making a case for. Although I would say we are still quite far from dealing with the prevalent anti-Blackness, past and present, in our region and in our field, at least in Middle East studies. I imagine this will come up in our discussion later on. Still, the incorporation of the peninsula and of North Africa has shed much needed light on the interlinkages that have tied the Middle East with other parts of the global South. And studying mobility in particular, studying mobility has allowed us to better understand the circulation of people, ideas, technologies, capital, colonial and neo-colonial techniques of rule that engendered, among other things, the forms of South-South solidarities, as well as broader global solidarities that my three esteemed colleagues wonderfully write about in nuanced and, I think, generative ways. Through these papers and the multi-scalar approaches they take, we see the different visions of the future, the different political imaginaries that intellectuals, artists, filmmakers, peasants, rural populations fought for, and in some cases, continue to fight for. Visions that marked different periods of the 20th century and into the 21st. The 20th century was one of heightened mobility, especially in its middle decades, And for those living then in the 1960s and 70s, for example, these decades were a time of popular political, intellectual, and cultural solidarities that challenged status quo forces and brought together artists and militants from every continent in the world. Yet these global solidarities and the political, cultural, and artistic networks they forged were so destabilizing. They were so destabilizing for imperial, for colonial, for post-colonial states that they had to be crushed and then analytically, spatially, and archivally severed. A severance whose absences and silences are only now being recuperated, if ever so partially. We see this in conferences such as this one, but also in various interdisciplinary and cross-regional projects that have emerged in recent years on inter-Asian mobilities, on Soviet-era cultural collaborations, on Afro-Arab nationalisms, among others. So despite this severing, despite the very real physical borders that have separated people for decades now, and despite the ever-improving technologies of surveillance, it is striking to see that different forms of global popular solidarity have persisted. Solidarity, it seems, defies borders. At least it can. Together and separately, the panelists demonstrate this. From the Maghreb generation and the Tunisian state-sponsored Journée Cinématographique de Carthage as a site that welded Pan-African solidarity and political affinities that produced counter-cultural projects, counter-cultural and sovereign representations of ideals and principles that challenged neo-colonial structures, that challenged things like authoritarianism. To the rural as a central site of radical politics, how circular patterns of migration in places like Tanzania, Congo, Sudan, and Mozambique, and a circular migration that is itself a response to the alienation that was felt in the move to the city, as well as a reaction to the changing global political economy. So how this circular migration has politicized rural populations in specific and productive ways, which among many things challenged prevalent ideas about, or challenges in this work at least, prevalent ideas about the peasant as a political site of tradition, and rejects the rural-urban divide that is entrenched not just in African studies, but in many fields and in many disciplines. And finally, to Du Bois's early commitment to and hope for Afro-Asian solidarity. Here, Al-Belushi does well to caution us of the perils of easy analogies and urges us to think critically about the question of trans-regional and transracial solidarity in the particular context of our moments. I will add to that I think we should think critically about what erasures we unwittingly commit in resurrecting occluded pasts and occluded linkages. So I'm gonna, my questions to the panelists, I have about like 65 questions, but I'm only gonna pose a couple. And my questions come from a place of deep engagement and admiration and curiosity. I found these three papers to be so thought-provoking and timely and quite instructive. And the first question I want to ask, it's a very short one, but I'm going to say it in a long way. And it's a question to all of you. Maybe less so to Professor Mampili, but I think it's also connected. So to what extent does the Cold War factor? I ask this not because I find the Cold War frame to be a generative or the most generative one, but because in some sense, I'm not sure we can escape it. Even the most stringent top-down Cold War era projects made many bottom-up mobilizations possible, made many ideational and material linkages, network solidarities, political imaginaries possible. The word Cold War does not appear in Professor Tolan-Sklinek's paper. It appears once in Professor Al-Belushi's paper, only in reference to Mahmoud Mamdani. And Professor Mampili, you mentioned it once only as a temporal marker, although you said you're working on something that is more contemporary. We know from recent scholarship on the Cold War that it was not simply a war between the two superpowers, that many smaller players across the world played a significant role in steering how the Cold War unfolded, and how for some scholars even the Cold War in fact predates World War II and extends back into the 1920s. We now know about the effect of the Cold War on domestic policies in the US and how different intellectuals have critiqued these domestic policies and how in their writing they had the Cold War in mind. But beyond the US, many Arab and African filmmakers studied at the Gerasimov Institute of Cinematography, the VGIK in Moscow, as Vasha Salti and Koyo Kuwo have taught us in their research project titled Saving Bruce Lee, African and Arab cinemas in the era of Soviet cultural diplomacy. Cold War cultural diplomacy, Soviet influence, they shaped many Arab, North African, African filmmakers and artists and their ideas about political imaginaries, about emancipation, about utopia. This is in terms of the films, the film world. But in terms of agrarian studies, in the context of the Cold War, China was a model for agricultural development in various parts of the Arab and African world since the mid-20th century. As Max Eil and others have taught us, at least in the case of Max Eil, he has written about this in the context of Tunisia. So I'm wondering if only based on Tunisia's linkages with sub-Saharan Africa, whether China didn't also play some role in agrarian or rural development there too, maybe not necessarily in a material way that we see it happening in the last decade or two, but in some form as a model as well. And I have follow-up questions on this, that I'll hear from you first and then. Thank you. Floor is open, whoever would like to take this question.
Okay, I'll start. On a very basic level, many of the filmmakers, as I mentioned, Saad Abdullah and as mentioned, then both studied in the Soviet Union. So many of them went to the Soviet Union. Tahar Sharia actually, when he at one point tried to nationalize the screen, and American companies, film companies were like, well, if you're going to nationalize, then you're not allowed to show any American movies. Or he wanted to show short Tunisian movies before every American movie, and the American movie companies weren't happy. So then he had like a conversation with Sovimport, like the Soviet Union, to see like if they would bring their movies to the Tunisian screens, because there weren't enough Tunisian movies to populate the screens. And then when Bourguiba found out about that, he put him in jail for 8 months. So there were definitely linkages, but also the governments, all three governments sort of played off of the Cold War power dynamics, either to criticize each other, saying, oh, well, Algeria being, saying Morocco and Tunisia are with the West, they're bought up by the US, and Morocco and Tunisia criticizing the Algerians for being, communists or things like that. So the sort of the specter of the Cold War was always there, was used to jail people at times, was used to, yeah, so it definitely the interplay of the sort of the political dynamics of the Cold War are the tram sort of these how do you say tram, the framework of these conversations. Absolutely.
Yeah, I would. Thanks for those remarks. Those are really helpful. And the Cold War, as you mentioned, I think is central to Mamdani's work for sure, arguing that we have to return to the Cold War to understand kind of the temporary war on terror, but specifically arguing that we have to return to the shift in U.S. foreign policy, its use of proxy war during the Cold War and Vietnam, but also in the African context to then understand the rise of the Mujahideen and later, right, U.S. war on terror. So it's crucial also for his understanding of Darfur, the conflict in Darfur, contextualizing it in history of militarization of the entire region, militarization of next door Chad, right? So absolutely. And then it's a crucial context for thinking about the Dar School as well. In many ways, you see this kind of two-step move between the politics at the level of government under Nyerere, Tanzania, at this time period, where although the government took a really strong stance in favor of the liberation movements throughout Southern Africa, which were obviously fighting against primarily white settler regimes and Portuguese colonialism against the Western Alliance, there was kind of a two-step to not anger the West too much. And certainly in the wake of the Zanzibari revolution, Nyerere's government looked to the West for support, right? So he wanted to kind of keep everyone on on good terms, right, with the Tanzanian government. And on the other hand, what was happening at the University of Dar es Salaam at this time was a more militant desire for the Tanzanian government to kind of break more strongly with the West, to align itself with not just other Southern African political projects, but more firmly, especially with China, as you mentioned. And then I think it's part of the backdrop for our attempt to think solidarity today, because many political movements tended to identify American imperialism as the #1 enemy during the era of the Cold War. And I think what many people have been saying is that, you know, our problem is unfortunately much bigger than that now than just American imperialism.
Yeah, I think if I was going to add to this, I think you said kind of laid out some of the concerns that I have. So the Cold War is very central to a lot of what I'm trying to do in this book project, which is to revisit a lot of the writing that was done by third world intellectuals and scholars, trying to understand the question of the geopolitical from the vantage point of Africa and Asia in particular. You know, Iqbal Ahmed is somebody I'm very influenced by. He has a fantastic piece called The Cold War from the Standpoint of the Victims. And I find that to be a very useful way to try to theorize what you refer to as a kind of multi-scalar approach, which is to try to take seriously geopolitics, but then to focus always on what it actually means for communities on the ground. And I think that's a real challenge, but I think by looking back on these earlier generations of writers and thinkers, that's almost kind of core to their approach. We're talking about Du Bois or Iqbal or Walter Rodney or some of these figures. What's really fascinating to me is how they have been kind of transformed, and their internationalism is kind of treated as a secondary concern. When you read their work, it seems so central to their entire identity. And I think that reflected their understanding that being from these communities, being from these spaces, you were more attuned and more impacted by these sort of shifts that are unfolding at the international level than perhaps anywhere else. So I think, you know, part of my interest in studying African rural struggles in particular, it's not because I'm interested in Africa per se, but also because of what it does about the world as a whole. And there's something about theorizing in those spaces that I think is very, very important and very fruitful for us to all attend. I also think that, you know, to refer to some of these same figures, there is, I have awareness of history by analogy, as you said, put it, drawing on Mondani, because I think there's a way in which, you know, a lot of these movements are saying things that are very different than how, especially those of us on the left in the United States, want to interpret that. Right? So the constant emphasis on US imperialism that shapes a lot of our work doesn't really capture the kind of more nuanced dynamics of world order that I think is present in their thinking, and really reflects this moment that we entered into, which is not a new Cold War like violence from the political science, but rather this much more diverse competition between, of course, the West, but also these new players, these new actors who are in many cases much more relevant for their day-to-day lives than say the traditional powers of the West.
I haven't read your foreign affairs piece, but I was struck how you citing that piece about the waning of U.S. imperium and this confidence in the statement that you just made. So I wonder, you know, if again, I have a lot of other questions, but I wonder if you can speak to that, because, you know, it's a debate. It's not self-evident that this is the waning of U.S. empire. I remember in 2000, in the early 2000s, when I had a different life and I was doing my MA in public policy and IR. Yes, you would know, right? Everybody at this institution, not this, but where I was from DC, working in policymaking. This was right after the Iraq War. And everything was about China. And everything was about reducing the Chinese threats, right? So in many senses, the last 20 years, policymakers in DC have been preparing for something like this, if not creating it. And so I don't know, I fall more on your side on the other argument, but I want to hear more about the certainty of the waning US imperialism. And also for Professor Belushi, you know, I want to just quote something you said, inciting both Professor Mampili and Professor El-Amin. You say this throws another wrench in the political project of transregional ties. So for most of us here in the room, when we think about transregional ties, we are not thinking about state-state ties. And Matessimi issue that you cite that says exactly that, right? So when we look at non-state to state solidarities, they very much still exist. So I wonder if you can say something about this as well.
Okay, fantastic question. I'll speak a little bit personally here that, for me, 25 years ago, when I first started getting interested in some of these questions, I was a student at the University of Dar es Salaam. I studied with some of these figures that Yusuf is referring to. And, it was a really fascinating kind of moment because we couldn't imagine the end of American empire. And it happened to me much faster than I would have expected. Right, you think about these sort of broad geopolitical shifts. I think that several people mentioned, and it's easier to imagine unfolding on a kind of decades-long scale rather than in this kind of relatively compressed time period that we managed to live through. I'm still relatively middle-aged. So it's the fact that I can speak to my life during the Cold War and my life today and how different it looks is pretty extraordinary, right? And the point I was trying to make about how much we learn from the past and how much we apply to understand the present is that in a way we want, right? If you are somebody who's interested in Afro-Asianism, if you look at economic trends, demographic trends, all these other various factors, it is clear that there's only two parts of the world that are growing today. It's sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, right? Increasingly, Asia is becoming the dominant economic player. Africa will continue to be more and more central to global politics. But it doesn't look like what we might imagine. There's a fantastic book by Abdurrahman Mabedi, a Somali writer called The United States of Africa. And he imagines a future where Africa is like the West, right? And it's erected all these exclusionary regimes to keep European and North American workers out. And I think that, I find that book to be very dystopian in a way, but also to be very reflective of this kind of conjuncture that we find ourselves in, right? One in which you have, Arab billionaires, South Asian billionaires, Nigerian billionaires who are operating in the most, brutal and extractive manner possible, right? So I guess my question is, are we even thinking about these processes in the right way? Right? We're so caught up in these kind of nation state frameworks that we inherited from the Cold War, which is inevitable if you think about it historically, but we're not perhaps paying enough attention to kind of the new formations, the new types of geopolitics that are emerging. One in which the rise of China or the rise of any put nation state X into that category is not as meaningful in a way as a result of these kind of shifting economic and political logics. So that you can have entire elites in Kinshasa or Lagos or Delhi for that matter, that are completely disconnected from the reality of the nation itself, right? In ways that I think raise fundamental questions about our focus as a political scientist on the state as the predominant entity as we enter into this new period, and requires us then to sort of try to make sense of what happened during the Cold War. And why it has all sort of seems to collapse so spectacularly so quickly. And again, I don't think these are just things that are limited to the so-called third world countries, but increasingly, explain what I see happening in the United States as well.
I mean, one of just a very quick comment on that. I remember very clearly historian James Galvin in 2003 on an Al Jazeera panel, where he was one of 5 saying this is the end of US empire. And this episode was banned from airing in the United States because at the time saying US and empire in the same sentence wasn't as.
It's amazing how easy we talk about it.
Yeah. So it's interesting to me to be thinking about this with that point. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that probably the question is more one of US hegemony in that sense. I think everybody would agree that the US still has the capability to do tremendous disruption around the world. And it's engaged in that. In Africa, we've seen the rise of AFRICOM as an attempt to counter, exactly like you said, competing powers entering into the continent. So the policy discourse of other powers entering the fray that you talked about that prevails here in Washington, D.C., is precisely an attempt to ignore the reality of many other actors actually being present and the need to engage with many of those actors rather than just attempt to reassert US unilateral dominance, right? An attempt to reproduce US hegemony. I think it's the hegemony that has been crumbling rather than the ability to materially impact the world negatively. So, and I think that brings up the second kind of analytical point, which is part of the project, as I think you're gesturing to, is to reconceptualize sovereignty in our current context, right? It's not just other states that are key actors against US interests, but many different, variety of actors, multinational corporations, non-government organizations, right? Armed actors, non-state actors, and social movements. So I think that's the task, is to rethink sovereignty in our current context. And I absolutely agree that movements like those that, you know, Zachariah was speaking about, like Lucia, and many other examples I know everybody in this room has worked on, are much better places from which to think that project today. And it was one of the pitfalls of the Third World Project, right? An exclusively statist orientation. I think that's what part of what I take Eleni Sadeki and Arash Tabari to be arguing, and attempts to resuscitate that project present. Have to do that with kind of at a greater distance from a state-centered model of doing politics.
I know I'm out of time, but I'm still gonna ask one more question, Professor Tolan Stilnick. And then, you know, you talk about, and you maybe tackled this on chapters before. You talk about how Bourguiba was amenable to Pan-Africanism. And so it was one way that filmmakers could legitimately or found avenues and support to actually engage in this project. At some point, you say the filmmakers you interviewed talked about this as a natural, affinity with Pan-Africanism that I was a bit curious about, especially since, you know, in a different turn just a few years ago, there was a big move in my field to connect North Africa to the rest of the Arab world. And so there was a lot about North African filmmakers and the Arab nationalism. North African filmmakers went to Moscow as well and met others and produced films and were quite outspoken about Palestine. So it's not either or, but I'm wondering if this played any significance in this particular Maghreb generation that you're writing about?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think that there are other groups that I look at too. The group around Souffle in Morocco, the literary journal, also talked about this sort of natural disposition to engage with African artists south of Sahara. There was sort of a shift, I think, for a while. So many of the people that I interviewed around Souffle at first would say, oh, we have more in common with the Levant. But then when they actually ended up going to Lebanon, or they were like, actually, I think we have more in common with the Senegalese. And I think, you know, Sharia talks about the Francophone culture. I think the experience of colonialism was really what brought together, in particular, the experience of being colonized by the French was what brought together Senegalese and Algerian, or Senegalese and Tunisian, for instance, but also the sort of dramatic experience of colonialism that Africans experienced in a way that the Lebanese didn't, for example.
They use Levant in particular?
Yeah, they use the Levant, yeah. And Abdelatif Labi says that, he says, we have a lot less in common with those of the Levant than we do with the radical sort of anti-colonialism of Amilcar Cabral or René Dupes, the Haitian poet. So they're actually seeing sort of connections even across the Atlantic as sort of more natural. I argue actually that that they predate Stuart Hall and their idea of political blackness and claiming the label of political blackness, and see themselves. Jean Sénac, for example, an Algerian poet, talks about being black as a form of sort of like political blackness, and talks about his black hands. And so I think that they see sort of this natural, and then things turn. In the 80s, the GCC really becomes sort of an Egyptian festival, partly because I think of the person that ends up sort of being presiding over the GCC had all these friends in Egypt and brought, you know, a bunch of Egyptian filmmakers. And a lot of the people that I interviewed said that's when the GCC sort of sold out to the West, and became glitz and glamour and sort of like a Cannes on African shores.
Okay, so thank you once again to our panelists, our discussants, the audience. Please feel free to continue the discussion for 10 minutes over coffee before we start the second panel.